All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. This is a pre-recorded webinar, so just be aware that we are editing in post. And yeah, this is our event on Plan B and just our conversation on sexual taboos for API women. My name's Shim, and I am the Senior Program Associate at OCA National. And I'm here with Rukmini.
Yeah, I'm Rukmini. I am the programs intern at OCA this summer.
Yeah, and a little bit about OCA. OCA is dedicated to advancing the social, political, and economic well-being of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. We are founded in 1973, and we are a 501c3 national nonprofit membership-driven organization based in Washington, D.C. with over 50 chapters and affiliates throughout the country. And yeah, and we're also here with Rosario and Nabila, who are also interns of our cohort.
So thank you all for being here. Rosario and Nabila are our communications intern and our programs policy and communications interns respectively. So thank you. We're also here with Malavika, Kannan, and Pranjal Jain. We're super excited to have them the co-hosts of the Brown Sugar podcast, and we'll tell you a little bit more about them.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, so excited.
Yes, okay. Malavika is a 20-year-old writer of books, essays, and journalism, as well as an advocate for queer women of color. Most recently, she was a 17 magazine Voices of the Year honoree. Malavika writes about Gen Z, identity, and culture for places like the Huffington Post, Washington Post, Teen Vogue, Refinery 29, Harper's Bazaar, Vice, and the San Francisco Chronicle. As an advocate for women of color, projects of hers include Brown Sugar, a sex and love podcast co-hosted by Pranjal Jain for brown girls everywhere. Currently, she's an English major at Stanford University. And as a powerhouse, Pranjal Jain is an Indian American organizer, founder of Global Girlhood, and co-host of the Brown Sugar podcast. Now a junior at Cornell studying industrial and labor relations, Pranjal has created numerous social justice events, curricula, and workshops, and has built organizational and digital power from the ground up. From fueling conversations around sex and sexuality to proudly claiming her identity as a previously undocumented South Asian woman, Pranjal is adding the representation you wanted when you were younger. I 100% agree. Y'all's podcast, I love it. It makes me feel so seen. And so I just want to start off with asking y'all, can you tell us a little bit about how you met and how, like, what the podcast is and how you decided to start it?
Started Brown Sugar podcast earlier this year as a sex and love podcast meant to be a guidebook and open conversation, a roadmap about sexuality for and by South Asian women. We started this entirely kind of like for ourselves, but we were really like happy to see like how it branched out into like a larger community. We feel like we're learning a lot of these issues like in real time, just like struggling through them, bulldozing through them as young like 20-something women out in the world, and we wanted to include other people in that journey.
That's great. I can say that like there's definitely a lack of brown women in this space, of AAPI women in this space, talking about sex, talking about love. Like even when I was trying to curate, you know, some resources for this event, I was really scouring the internet. I was like, why is there nothing out here? And so when y'all started the Brown Sugar podcast, I was super, super excited. And so one of the reasons that we wanted to have this event is because of a movie that recently came out called Plan B. So I think that watching Plan B like sort of made me realize the dearth of representation because it provided some. And so basically the movie revolves around two like girls who are in high school, one of whom has a really awkward first sexual encounter, and then she wakes up the next morning, she goes to pee and the condom falls out and she's like, oh crap. And so basically the movie is about like the journey to try to find Plan B, and it encompasses a lot of different things. It talks about difficulty like accessing Plan B, period, like what it feels like to be a young woman having had a first sexual experience, not having a lot of like resources and support. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the movie. Did you feel seen? Like what did that representation feel like to y'all?
I can go first. I think that movie was, I mean, there was a lot of different like portions to it, right? Like I think the part especially where the other protagonist has a little bit of like her own like coming of age, like queer love story, I think was really beautiful. And I think like the nuances and stuff were great too. In terms of what's her name? I know her real name, Fuhu. What's her name? Sunny, right?
Sorry,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. So I loved like the beginning of the movie where it literally like starts with her like masturbating to her biology textbook. I was like, okay, something about this feels really on brand. I don't know why. But then later on, as like the movie continues, a part that I really appreciated was where when she was about to have this like transactional like sexual encounter with like that rando drug dealer in exchange for like a potential Plan B pill that might also be like PCP. I know like it was supposed to be like comedic and stuff like that, but I think something about it really touched on like how I think for like our generation too, and with a lot of like, you know, conversations around feminism sometimes, sex ends up being and sexual acts and stuff end up being and feeling really transactional for people. And I think there's a lot of different like layers and meanings to like sexual acts. And I think like that in its own like little funny way sort of touched on it, and also touched on like the other like, you know, like toxic masculinity and like patriarchal portions that also come in with sexual stigma, and I mean not sexual acts, and just like the whole existence of and sphere of sexual activity.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that Pranjal said. I think that the movie was really smart about talking about like the different implicit power dynamics and the ways that young people engage in sex. I think something that I really loved about this movie, in addition to the fact that like I related so viscerally to like the South Asian character, the queer character, like I felt like a mix of both of them. I think something that like stood out to me about this movie and movies like it, as opposed to like other maybe older stories about like teenage girls, is that there isn't this idea of like the loss of innocence. Like I like how the girls like from the beginning know that they want to have sex, and like that is like their goal. Like it's very clear that like, and that the girls are, they don't necessarily have anything like to learn about sex from other characters. Like they know what they want. And I think like the fact that like when like her friend comes out to her the way that Sunny's like, yeah, of course I'd be on board with you like being queer. I think that knowledge that we already know what we're doing was what I found really relatable about the movie. The fact that these girls weren't necessarily having like hard lessons foisted on them or losing their innocence, but that they already had a strong sense of agency in what they wanted.
For sure. And I think that the movie like also takes that, but it also like lets us know that they're still vulnerable and that they still could use support. I think my favorite part of the movie was 100% at the end, where she doesn't find Plan B in the Planned Parenthood, and she's like breaking down in the parking lot, and she's like, I need my mom. And I feel like that experience is such a relatable experience, because like sex is hard. Sex and dating are hard. And it's like, I feel like especially within Asian communities, we have such like tight-knit, close families. We rely on our parents and our familial ties. And it's like, when it comes to this like giant area of life, at least for me, it didn't feel like, you know, there was a lot of room to talk about it. And so it was like, well, who do I go to? Like, who do I trust?
Yeah, I too really love that she went back to her mom at the end. I think that was like one part of it that I thought was really beautiful and very relatable, is I think that like a lot of people who are like first generation especially feel like they have to navigate a lot of this stuff on their own, or that like our parents aren't there to hold our hand through it. And I really liked that like the movie then chose to show like a South Asian mom like coming to her daughter's aid when she really needed it.
I remember growing up, I would feel so jealous of my friends, usually like white friends, who would talk about like dating and like, yeah, just anything with their parents. And just, I was like, man, that's like a thing. Like, that's so, ah.
No, I completely feel you on that. I mean, I still feel like that. I'll be like, my friends will be like, yeah, and I like my mom gave me a condom, and I was like, could never be my mom. Like my parents don't even know about brown sugar. They don't know about like, you know, a lot of the work that I do too. But something else that I really enjoyed about the movie, sort of just speaking on what Malavika and Rukmini were talking about, was that her first instinct was to go to her best friend. And I think that's so beautiful. And I think that was really relatable for me too, because it's like, I mean, like for me, I can't go to my parents, I can't go to my mom. That's just like not really like an option. And I would do exactly what Sunny did there too. So I love to see it.
Yeah, I agree with Pranjal. I've had similar experiences, and I thought that was really beautiful how I think for a lot of daughters of immigrants or who don't have that relationship with their parents when it comes to sex, you kind of lean on older sister figures. And that was definitely like the experience for me, and also best friends who kind of help you through it. And I think that it was heartbreaking, but also really real, the fact that a lot of this movie takes place with her being more afraid of her mom's reaction than possibly like the health effects of what just happened to her. And I thought it was really special that the ending does kind of like reconcile with that, of like that her health and her safety is more important, is the first thing that her mom was concerned about, rather than going behind her back and whatever sex means to them. So I thought that was really special. And yeah, the relationship between Sunny and her best friend was so special to see.
I did appreciate though that like when like she talks to her mom is like, I don't want you to feel like distant from me. Like I want you to feel like you can talk to me about this. But it's also like very visible that like the broader Indian community, the broader South Asian community is like still unhelpful. Like when they go back to the pharmacist and the mom's like, I need a Plan B pill. Like the pharmacist is so unhelpful, and like the whole morality clause. And so it's like the layers of it, right? Like the fact that like not only is this like taboo within the Indian community or the South Asian community, it's like also like there are so many ways in which the medical system, like the government allows the medical system to prevent women from having access to contraception, like Plan B. And so it's like, okay, you're fighting through so many different experiences, like so many different identities to be able to get something that you really need. And I think that I really felt like like Sunny's insecurity, you know what I mean? When she goes to the party, she wants Hunter. He's like the cool, popular white boy. He's hot, you know, and she's like, you know, as somebody who is like, you know, was fat as a kid, South Asian, like a little awkward, like I felt that. Like I felt that experience of like standing in the party and being like, that's the one. Like he's gonna elevate me to desirability, right? Like, and I really like how the movie comes like sort of full circle on that, and they have this like nice like romantic moment where it's clear that they're interested in each other as people.
Something I was going to add to about like the stigma of getting Plan B even just in the pharmacy is that the lack of accessibility just in general with like how expensive it is not the only thing. It's like it's locked, it's in the back, you have to ask for people to get it. Like it's if you already have fear of stigma, that's just going to be multiplied by like so much just by your experience of going to the pharmacy.
And like the thing that I worry about too with like, you know, the way that we depend on like people who are our own peers is like misinformation or like lack of information. Like I've had people that I like haven't talked to in a while call me and be like, hey, like I took Plan B and I'm bleeding. Is that normal? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm like sitting there on WebMD, like if you bleed after you take Plan B, are you dying? Like, you know what I mean? And it's like, what if we actually had access to adults or like, you know, medical information that's real and not provided by the internet?
Yeah, completely. I was just gonna add to like in terms of stigma, I think if you like are like there's already the stigma around like access to things, right? And then on top of that, if you do access it, being able to just like understand how to use it, and even just before accessing it, knowing about it, there's just so many different like obstacles. And when there's stigma, like who do you go to? Who do you ask? Like especially with like, you know, high school education's like sex ed curriculum, it's so shitty. They literally don't talk about any of this stuff. For a lot of South Asian and just Asian women in general, you can't go home, so you don't have your parents. So like, where are you left? I think social media has been really filling in those gaps for me. I follow a lot of like sex educators and like content creators that create around sex education. But at the end of the day, like I'd love something more comprehensive. I'd love something that I was able to learn about and be immersed into at a younger age, so that when I'm not like after the deed being like, what do I do? I wish I knew before.
So Malavika or Pranjal, like a lot of like sex and dating and like sex ed content is, especially on TikTok, is being created by white people. So what does it feel like to be in that space, like so visibly as brown women?
I think it kind of goes back to what Pranjal said before about how there's like a big gap that needs to be filled and we're trying to do our best to fill it. I mean, we are not like sex educators, and I think that's like a gap that you know, like actual adults and professionals are going to fill. But I think that like what we are trying to do with like our podcast and like our like internet presences in general is trying to like create a space where more people can see themselves represented. I think one of the hardest parts for young South Asian American women growing up in their sexuality amid the stigma is like the dual rejection, both from the white dominant culture and from like the internal South Asian culture. So I think just being able to provide people with like alternate models of like of people telling them they're okay, like what it means to be like South Asian and like sexual is like kind of what we're trying to do. Like, I mean, our experiences are just that of two people, but I think that like we're hoping to just let more people see that like being sexual, like having these conversations is something that they too can do.
Oh my God, you're so smart. Literally love the way you said all that. I don't have much to add. I do want to say that like every time I think we put out an episode or even just like post on Instagram looking hot, I feel like we are trailblazing. I love to be in the space that we're in. I love to do the work that we do. I also just think in general, like I sometimes, like Malavika was saying, I also sort of like feel that like morality and like shame. Sometimes I'm just like, oh my God, like if my parents see this, they'd cry. Like, but at the same time, I'm kind of just like, I think it's important so that like I like for me personally, I sort of realized and came into like my sexuality when I was 17, 18. Before then, for all of high school, I like didn't even know that I had that capacity in me. But when I stepped into my sexuality, I derived a lot of power into it. And I think I became more whole and understood more of like the layers and facets of myself. And I just think sometimes like if that had happened earlier, I wonder what like my journey would have looked like. So I hope that like what me and Malavika do empowers those other younger Asian women to at least start thinking and exploring around their own sexualities.
Yeah, that can be a very hard thing to do, you know, being young, being AAPI woman, to feel like that sense of freedom. And so I want to like dig into that a little bit more. If anyone want to share, like, what is the experience of stigma like looked like for you?
I'm going to attempt this, but I also want to mention some things that were mentioned previously. I think with like sex and power, it's not only like the physical health, but the emotional health. And what Pranjal was saying about, you know, that cultural shame and the many layers and, you know, not being able to go to your mother, your family. I think it's a lot to unpack because when you can go you can go to a friend and say like, you know, this is what happened. I have, you know, like, can we go to Planned Parenthood? Can we get Plan B? But in terms of that emotional journey of like what you've done, it's so difficult because if people do not know you enough, they don't know your background, they don't know, you know, where you're coming from, it's so much harder to shift through. And I would say, I think that is kind of my biggest thing with the whole stigma of it. You know, I have other Asian American friends who are also sheltered. And that's really the only people who I can talk to about like kind of my emotions and seeing and you know what Pranjal said about sex being transactional. I think that like is really hard to kind of get away from just because when I was younger, I was taught like, you know, it's between a man and a wife, and also like you almost can't deny it to your husband. And so it just becomes like it doesn't become fun. It doesn't become something you're supposed to enjoy. And I think that's a lot of trauma that a lot of Asian Americans need to kind of work through because really it should be more than that. And I've heard it from my white peers that it's supposed to be passion and it's supposed to be an expression, but I don't think that is what is seen to at least a lot of me and my peers.
Yeah, I think even what Nabila said about the ability to deny sex, I was thinking and like talking with my friends the other day, because I didn't grow up having these conversations or having a lot of communities kind of talk through these situations, that when I did start dating and when I did get into more intimate relationships, I didn't have practice saying no, or like vocalizing my boundaries, just because I didn't talk about sex with anyone. So I think there's so much, like, on a practical side, even though like I've been educated in college about consent, and in my head that I know that I have the power and that I can say no, and that I should and have control over my own body, because I didn't have a community to kind of practice and have those conversations with before I was in relationships or in situations where I wanted to say no, that even though I wanted to, like in my heart, like my body couldn't catch up. So I think that's definitely how stigma has played out for me, is just the lack of talking about it. So I admire the two of you, Malavika and Pranjal, for having a podcast, because there's young women out there who are hearing these conversations and hopefully talking about them with their friends, and kind of having practice and kind of being comfortable with this language, so that when they are in situations and are starting to create these relationships, they can vocalize what their boundaries are.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that vocalizing boundaries is like a big part of stigma that like I didn't learn about growing up. I think like the flip side to like the conversation about stigma is that in addition to sex being something that you can provide for other people that you can't necessarily say no to, I think a lot of my early messaging about sex was that sex was also something bad, something that could like reflect poorly on you, something that was like a corrupting force. And so to have your sexuality like palpable to others was like a big problem. Like I remember like learning like even like when girls got into puberty, that the changes that were happening to them were bad, you know, that like that girls should be covering up what was going on, that like we were like losing something innocent about ourselves. So I think like this idea of like sexuality as like loss or dirtiness, as opposed to like something that you can grow and flower, was a big part of the stigma for me.
Yeah, I also think the stigma, I mean, we've been talking about this, but has led to a lot of like lack of education and awareness. A while ago, my friend asked me who gave me the talk, and I was like, I think myself. I don't know, like, what about you guys? Like, have you, like, who gave you the talk? Do you remember? And then also another thing that I think the stigma has led to is just like a lot of, I think like waters that we have to tread really lightly, and it's annoying to have to do that, especially like with my mom, for example. Like I would love that kind of like transparency, and also just I'd love for her to, or I mean just women in general, not to like put it all on her, but like I'd love to see Asian women talk about it more, and then center their pleasure, because I think from that there's just gonna be so much more like societal change and stuff too, and then you'd raise a generation that would be able to say things like no, that would understand their boundaries, that would step into their sexuality earlier too.
I think I was like 21 or yeah, something like that, before I had my first like enjoyable experience. And it was because like the partner at the time like asked me things like, what do you enjoy? And I was like, I had no idea. And again, like if we had conversations about this and it became something we could enjoy, Malavika, I loved how you said like flower your sexuality, then it could just be so much easier.
Pranjal, to your question about the talk, I never got a talk, right? My parents were like, when my sibling got to a certain age, they were like, hey, do you want to talk to her about some things? Like, not even like, hey, can you tell her about sex? Like, do you want to like, whatever. Like, even the word, me asking my mom to get a bra was a conversation. It was like I had a whole speech prepared, because I was so ashamed of the fact that I had breasts, and I had them really early, and like it was like uncomfortable for me. But it's like, this is the thing that's familial, right? Like this is the thing that's been passed down to me by my mother. And so it's like we sort of like, I really enjoy, Pranjal, what you said about like raising the next generation to not be so ashamed of their bodies, because like it feels like it's been like passed down. You know what I mean? Like every time like a young Asian girl gets to a certain age, or she goes through puberty, or she finds her sexuality, it's like everything in like the parenting and like the broader system is like shut it down. You know what I mean? And like that just keeps happening. But yeah, no, I remember I was in elementary school and somebody at my table gave us all sexual nicknames. And I remember he was like, "You're the humper." I did not know what that meant. I was like, that doesn't sound good. So I went home and I looked it up on Urban Dictionary. Like that was like, I was like, oh, I can find things out on the internet. Like that was the talk. The internet gave me and it was so wrong. So much of it was like so messed up, you know?
Man. I had a teacher in 6th grade. Her name was Miss Bonner, but it was spelled Boner, Boner. And I remember being like, everyone was laughing. I remember being like, maybe in the 9th grade when I understood. I was like, oh.
Yeah, I think that I also wasn't really given the talk. It's always like an assumption that I'm gonna be pure and not do anything. I think also like especially when I was dealing with like my menstrual health, it was my mom warning against me that tampons will make you lose your virginity. And so like I didn't like pads, so I just like did it in secret or bought them privately. And then when I switched to menstrual cups, which I find more sustainable, it's like an even bigger thing. Like I told them I was buying it, but they don't have a concept of what it is, and I think it's the best way to do so because they would almost freak out as well. So yeah, I also definitely relate, Rukmini. I was like way too young to be looking at stuff on the internet, but I think I'm happy now because I see on YouTube there are more conversations about sex and dating and just health in general, which I didn't see when I was growing up.
Yeah, I think tampon stigma is so real. It's like not even a thing in India. People don't know what tampons are, which is so unfortunate, right? Because like, for example, I mean, this is just the thing that came to mind, but like, for example, like swimmers, if there's like a young woman that's going to be the next like freaking Olympics, like, swimmer, not being able to practice for that 1 week too without a tampon is such an inhibition. It really limits like her potential and what she can achieve. And also speaking to Rukmini with the like the talk that you had to have with your mom with the bra, it made me think of I think a lot of like custom in like South Asia with like giving the talk is like the night before like the honeymoon, or no, the night of like the wedding, and a lot of like cultures and stuff is when they like consummate the wedding or whatever. So that's usually when the mom of the bride will give her like a quick conversation. She'll just like, usually it's something like, oh, like, rest up, just like follow his lead. And that's the conversation. So it doesn't really get into like the actual like intimate details of what's going to happen either. Like there are also some really important things that you need to know, right? Like you need to pee after sex. Like who's gonna tell you that, right? Like those small things too. I think like if like we talked about them earlier, and if we just like created that conversation from the beginning, would change so much of health dynamics too. And again, going back to like the tampon and the swimmer thing, would really increase women's and young girls' potentials.
I think that's also a part of like, I don't know if you guys watched Bridgerton, but that's a part of like Bridgerton, right? Of like when she gets married and he's like, I don't know if they're married, but he is talking her through what it is. And I think like my friends, white friends, were like, that's so unrealistic. And I was like, nope, it's happening still right now for Asian people.
Malavika, I kind of wanted to ask, like, a lot of even what we are told about sex is very like heteronormative. So for you, as someone who's like LGBTQ, how does the stigma affect you differently, and how have you moved through it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the stigma feels like a whole different ballpark. Like I think that like this, I think that at least for South Asian women, we're not really expected to have any sexual desire at all. So like to have sexual desire for like someone who's not a man feels like even more unthinkable. And I think honestly, just like the blanket like no on dating honestly makes it a little bit easier, I think, in a way sometimes to be able to explore like alternative modes of sexuality and to like make these realizations about yourself. Like I guess it is a little easier to like realize you're not attracted to men if you're not allowed to date men, you know? So I think that like in some ways like it does feel like a little blessing in disguise, but I think in other ways like the stigma is really strong. But I think again the stigma for just all sexuality across the board is so strong. But I think that maybe what makes like queerness feel so unforgivable to more like conservative and patriarchal modes of thinking is that like it presents a model of sexuality that just like negates the need for a man whatsoever. Because the reason that we police female sexuality like so aggressively is because we want to keep women like available for like the men who want them. We want like women to only belong to the men that they marry to. We want women to be transactional in that way. So I feel oftentimes that like queerness is kind of just like a get out of jail free card. Like it's a way to just circumvent that entire question of like negotiating female sexuality amidst like the demands of patriarchy.
Also, I think for a lot of Asian countries, it traces back to like pre-colonization, so pre-colonial morality too. And I think that that's a lot of like unhealed wounds. And so just even imagining that sort of like freedom and liberation in society, like you were saying, Malavika, and I know me and you talk about this all the time, but I think from you especially, I learned that like queerness is a mode of thinking, and it's the most imaginative and most radical mode of thinking. And I think for, for example, I'm just speaking in terms of like the subcontinent, for, countries that haven't been able to even like provide equality and even think in terms of like equality and liberty and fraternity, the way that their founding fathers thought of it, to be going to the next step and thinking about like, a society that accepts queerness, that accepts like the radical imagination that goes behind it, is just so unfathomable.
I hear you. I think that like in a lot of my interactions with South Asian men, there's either like you're either like the pure perfect woman that they're gonna marry, or you're fun. The amount of times that I've been called like fun by like a brown man in the sense of like, oh, you'll sleep with me. We can have casual sex. This isn't gonna go anywhere. Like these are the only two modes that I feel like South Asian men have when it comes to looking at South Asian women. And then queerness is like beyond, like there is no like binary, there's no like rigidity, you know what I mean? And so I think that especially for like South Asian, like cis hetero men, like to imagine a world where like queerness is accepted and like flourishes is so difficult because everything is like dictated. You know what I mean? It's either like if you're a woman, you're either like this or like this. And if you're a woman who's like not interested in men, like that doesn't exist. You know what I mean? That's not right. Like,
I love that you brought up like the binary that exists with like South Asian men. I think that also, I mean, is obviously very closely related to stigma and lack of education. I think because South Asian women and just Asian women in general aren't expressing their desire and expressing pleasure and just all the different modes of expression that come with sexuality, I think it makes it even easier for men to be like, oh, okay, she's either gonna, like sleep with me, whatever, or I'm gonna marry her and she's gonna be super like, demure and stuff like that. I think if more women start owning that, I think there's going to be the in-between that people will be able to recognize. And I mean, men especially will be able to recognize and understand. And I mean, I don't know, maybe it's just an emotional like immaturity, but
we don't have to spend too much time talking about straight men, but I think this is something that you guys talked about in one of your podcasts is like how men both shame you and they will sexualize you. Can you talk a little bit more about like the role of South Asian men in creating that like identity for yourself?
Just to clarify, what identity?
Oh, just like labeling you for the rest of society or for everyone else. Like, or just the effects that it has on you. like slut shaming, or and like on the flip side, like being seen as not sexual at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I, as a person, am always quite motivated by revenge. So I think that, like, honestly, like sometimes, like, the experience of feeling like slept on or like discouraged by like South Asian men in high school is what like fuels me to like be like my most like unapologetic and like successful and like sexual like queer self now. So I think that maybe for me it was like a good motivation, but I also agree that it is like a real problem in that like the way that we're treated by like our own men can have like a really stunting and chilling effect on South Asian women's growth, because I think that there's like that dual problem of like of our sexuality is stigmatized by them, and at the same time we're also kind of put down as like a second choice by them. So I can imagine that for South Asian women for whom like brown men maybe felt like their only choice or like an early form of rejection, that could sting for a while.
Yeah, I'm still trying to like formulate my thoughts around this. And I know I remember in the episode we were talking about you know, like the tier of brown boy misogyny. And like Malavika said, I love the way that she talked about like revenge. I am not as motivated by revenge. I wish I was. So I think sometimes for me it does sting. It's also a lot of like a learning curve of being able to understand what I look like outside of like that validation, that acceptance, etc. You know, which sucks that I even have to bring up, but it's just true. Sometimes I think I gain a lot of like validation from these men and their thoughts. So I guess, I mean, at the same time, I love that I'm able to like look beyond that and try and think about like what my sexuality looks like independent of a partner, right? Because you don't need a partner to be a sexual being. And then I also think thinking about this has given me a lot of perspective on like culture too. Like we talk about in the episode, like we see with like Mia Khalifa and so many other you know, more sexualized brown women. Brown men love to police, but they also love to partake. And I think being able to call them out on that hypocrisy and understand how that like works with their own sort of like systems and like the way they exhibit their masculinity and stuff helps you better understand sort of like what you're dealing with, and also helps you better understand like what kind of partner you're looking for, and what like the power dynamics and what the schools of thoughts are at play when you are interacting with these men.
I feel like I'm really hearing like what y'all was saying. Like someone said like brown women are always feel like a second choice to brown men. And I feel like in that, like I feel like particularly like here, I feel like brown men feel like they have access to South Asian women in a way that like in a way where they're like uninhibited. So like for example, like the way that like some like South Asian men have talked to me, I'm like, you would never talk to somebody who is white this way, because you see me as disposable and you see them as the goal, right? And like for example, like this, I was like at the grocery store and I came home and I like didn't talk to anyone, I didn't make eye contact with anyone, and some brown man had left his name and number on the hood of my car, like on a sheet of paper. And I was like, this is so invasive of my space, of like my privacy. I haven't spoken to you. I don't know who you are. Like, why do you think that you can do this? And I feel like part of it is because like, you know, South Asian men feel like they like South Asian women owe something to them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely feel entitled. And I think that also has to do with the culture, right? My friend once sent this to me, but she was just like, brown women raise their daughters but love their sons. And I was like, yeah, you know, that's like one of the biggest problems. But going back to what you were saying, Rukmini, about like the way they would talk to like a white woman versus the way they talk to like a brown woman. I don't know if you've like have seen those TikToks and stuff, but like if it's like a brown guy like on like in a TikTok with like a white woman, like all the comments will be like, oh bro, you made it, like go off, whatever, right? And I'm just like what? Like I hate to see it. So yeah, I really do think that that creates such a divide and such a, like we were talking about, like second choice feeling.
And I think that that feeling leads, at least has led for me, to what Rosario was describing earlier, in terms of like being in sexual situations where you feel like you should have more power, but somehow feel like you're blocked off from it. Because you know, you're already at this like imbalance. I feel like, at least for me, I felt like I was at an imbalance, like less knowledge, like way more naive, like didn't have a lot of resources to turn to, like, and then feeling like somebody's like doing me a favor by finding me attractive, especially as somebody who like grew up fat, right? Like that was very much like a thing. And then being shamed for that in South Asian cultures, like there were a lot of like layers to where I was like, oh, if somebody, you know, wants me, wow, that's like mind blowing. That's like, I need to be grateful for that. It needs to be like, I need to then like provide something in return. Like, and I think that that, like a lot of like, I think, like, I feel like a better model of like raising a South Asian woman would be like, you are a whole person. You are like what Pranjal was saying, right? Like you are sexual and you are a sexual person regardless of if anybody else is in that realm for you. I feel like that's something that we really miss because we don't have these conversations.
I really think Eastern societies are like truly set up for that more than Western societies are, especially being in India recently. I've been thinking about this a lot, but I think like over here, I feel no desire or like, yeah, no desire to reach out to like any sort of partner. I feel no desire for a partner to fill any sort of like gap in my life. And it's because there's such a heavy focus on like family, families and love over there and stuff. I feel really fulfilled by that, right? And so if like Eastern societies were to just start opening up that conversation around sexuality and treat it with like the lens of helping you flower into your most wholest self, like I think it's so built in versus with the West, where so much like conversation and like goals and dreams are really revolved around true love, finding a partner. With modern day, you know, like post Sex in the City, how many partners you're with, what that looks like for you, how much you're like investing in them, how much they're investing in you, how you're playing the field, all that goes with that. So I really do think that like there's like a clear like difference, and I think Western societies emphasize it so much to the point where it's just like I think you lose a part of yourself, and I think you lose the understanding of you as a whole being. I've been able to better understand what I'm like as a sister, a granddaughter, a daughter, like you know, like a sister-in-law, a niece, etc. in India, and it's given me a lot more layers to who I am as a person. So then having like even just an understanding of like my sexuality, independent or you know with a partner, I think would change the ballgame completely. Versus in the West, I don't think I'd be able to get all those other different things. And even if I did, I don't think society talks or emphasizes or cares enough for it to cultivate.
I was just going to ask, because you're talking about how Western societies are so obsessed with true love and all those things. I was also going to ask, like, how many of you guys took the Rice Purity test? The really stupid, the really stupid test that everyone makes you do because they're like, oh, the lower the number, like, you know, yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of Western societies are really obsessed with like ticking things off a box and being able to be like, you know, I'm so bad, like I did this, this, and this. And I think we forget like the intentions behind it. And I think in Eastern societies, because so much like, you know, stuff in romantic realms is duty bound, there's already so much more intention behind it. And I mean, obviously that has its pros and its cons, because you still want to have like freedom to be with someone that you love, etc. But it almost feels like everything is a lot more intentional here. And a lot of the times the end goal isn't to have sex with someone. It's also just not like the first thing that you do. I think there's a lot more different, you know, steps and stuff that come with it. So I wonder what that would look like in the West. I almost wonder if we can ever, or if there is space for that to truly cultivate as a culture. I don't know, something I was just like thinking about and hypothesizing is I think like recently with like the rise of social media, you know, TikTok culture and all this other stuff, I hope, and yeah, you know, honestly, at the end of the day, I truly do hope that Gen Z sort of gets like tired of this constant movement, and hopes to like take a step back and sort of go back to like our roots and just really like feel and be with all.
I think we inhabit a very particular space as Asian Americans where we could do that. That's why I feel like, you know, a lot of people like think of a hyphenated identity as like something that's like a disadvantage, but I'm like, we have the opportunity to create something that doesn't look like either of these cultures that we're supposed to inherit. You know what I mean? Like we have the opportunity where like South Asian American or Asian American doesn't have a set definition yet. You know what I mean? There's not a way where that should look. And so we can move, I feel like we can use that term and like that feeling of community to move our communities forward, or like make, like we have the space to have them look different.
I agree. And I feel like something like overarching to like what has just been said is this idea that like in the face of like so much kind of just like rejection or like denial from so many of like the forces surrounding us, whether that's like the men of our peer group that we're supposed to be dating, whether that's white people, whether that's our parents, whether that's just like the lack of sex education resources in our school systems. I think that like this idea that we have to create our own alternative spaces or kind of like do it ourselves has kind of been like a big urge for me. And I think it can be kind of scary because I think like the characters in Plan B, we do feel like we're kind of just like making it up as we go along, that we are literally like on a road trip with no particular destination in mind. Like I actually felt like that was like the perfect metaphor for like coming of age sexually as like an Asian American, as a first generation person, as a woman of color, whatever. And I really think that like spaces like these can maybe help provide a little bit more of a roadmap like as we go on that journey.
That was a really amazing way to put it. Like, I think that you put into language a lot of what I'm feeling right now. But maybe like kind of everyone to answer like a maybe like a more wrap up or closing question. Can we all talk about like what the importance of breaking this taboo is, or what that would look like, or what our hopes are for this space?
My hopes are, speaking from like a personal level, for every time we drop a Brown Sugar podcast, every time I post with a vibrator, every time I post something more, you know, like scandalous and like whatever, for it not to be sent everywhere, for it not to be in group chats, for it to be something like, instead I'd love to see it be like, oh, like go off, like, oh, I love to see it, or something that everyone does. I think the digital space has changed so much. And I think like if we are engaging in, you know, these conversations, or even just like having sex in real life and engaging in sexual activities, I think translating that into digital spaces in really meaningful ways, and in real life spaces in meaningful conversation and education based spaces should be natural. And I mean, and it is, it's just like not being done enough. So I'd love to see more people just engaging.
I think for me, my hope is, so I am an aunt now. My sisters have daughters, and as they grow up and I start to have conversations with them and they kind of come into their own people, my hope is that they're able to grow up and express their sexuality and have experiences and not feel like when they go home, they're a different person. Because I think that before I went off to college and was physically distanced away from my family, not living with them every day, and that I was able to live like nobody was watching, I kind of felt like my more authentic self, and I could explore sex and I can explore relationships without the judgment or maybe the baggage that my family and the expectations that my family had put upon me as the youngest daughter. So that I hope that by having community spaces like this, having more open conversations, being more honest, and kind of starting to learn how to like take ownership of my sexuality, that I can create a more loving and welcoming space for my nieces, and that they, when they grow up and they go home physically, they don't feel like they're switching between two identities. They're just themselves.
My wish is a little bit of a big ask. So I wish that religion slash spirituality can be broken down a little bit, so it's not all all based on patriarchal like desires and needs. Because I think spirituality can be a beautiful thing, and it's a big part of most cultures, something that brings a lot of families together, and it also creates stigma, and like it paints the ideal woman as someone who's very demure. So that's what I would like to see.
I think going off of like having two different selves, I think seeing someone as whole within like their sexuality, I think is really important. And there's always this phrase of like in the sheets versus the streets, right? But that's really like a whole person. And I like what was said previously about, raising a generation where they feel open and honest and can really feel like their full self, even, with their family as well. Because, I want to share this with my family. I want to share this with the generations that come after me, and I feel like I shouldn't hide it. So that's what I want.
Yeah, I agree. And I think like to echo that, like what I hope for in this space is that it also encourages like Nabila was saying, like that kind of authenticity, that kind of like there doesn't need to be a separate version of ourselves, like how we are and how we present to the world. I also just like really hope that like whatever spaces we can create can be really open to like growth and like making mistakes and like healing and like realizing that like that sexual growth is like not linear. I think that like something that I have resented is that oftentimes in like feminist spaces, there's kind of like a girl boss mindset towards like sexuality that like you are either repressed or you are like out on the streets, like you are on Tinder, you are like a hoe, like you are like bagging bitches left and right. And I think that like that does empower people, but I think that like we can also have room for nuance. We can have people who say like I am sexually empowered, but like I choose to be celibate because I want to be with people who respect me. Or we have people who say like no, I want to set boundaries in my relationships, or that like I only want to have sex in the context of relationships. So I think that like if we had like a space where all modes of sexual expression were equally valued and equally viewed as empowering, I think that could be really nice.
That resonates a lot for me, Malavika, because like I feel like growing up the way that I did, because I felt so like unwanted and undesirable, I had this imagination of myself where I would like grow up and all of a sudden I would be like hottie thotty, like it girl, you know what I mean, that every man wanted to be with, and then I would just run through them, you know what I mean? So I grew up and I used to watch How I Met Your Mother, and like Barney has his like scrapbook of like 200 women that he's been with, and I was like, I'm gonna do that. Like this was like me at like 13, like someday when I'm 20, like that was what I thought was like the peak of like reaching sexual empowerment. And like now that I am 20, I'm like, no. Like first of all, that was weird as hell. But secondly, like empowerment is more about like how I feel about myself and how I feel in the situations that I'm in than any kind of like tick box number, whatever, right? And like that was the other thing about the Rice Purity test is like, like the idea of like sex being like a checklist, like you just have to do it. It doesn't have to be good, it just has to get done so you can say that you did it. So I hope that like as we continue having these conversations and as we continue opening up space and like as we continue hearing episodes of the Brown Sugar podcast, like we find like Malavika was saying, like we find other ways, like ways that we can define sexuality for ourselves and feel comfortable in it, and that don't have to fit into any type of like box. And then also just, I want to see a world in which Asian American or AAPI sex ed resources are a thing, where we have like culturally relevant sex ed resources that are easy to access, that are available, that don't, like talk to us like we're dumb or like we're all the same, but like that really engage with us as people. Yeah, that's also a big ask, Jay, but.
Hey, this is all about the big asks. So yeah, I just want to thank you guys so much, Nabila, Rosario, and Malavika and Pranjal, for engaging in this conversation with us. I also want to give you guys a quick minute if you guys want to plug anything. Totally okay if not.
About it, but like we have been mentioning, we do have a podcast that centers sexuality for South women specifically, though all women and women of color are welcome. And it's at Brown Sugar on like all streaming platforms.
Okay. Well, yeah, I so enjoyed this. Oh, Pranjal, go ahead. Do you have anything?
No, I was just gonna echo exactly what Malavika said. Follow us on TikTok. It's at Brown Sugar Pod. And on Instagram, we're at the Brown Sugar Pod.
Great. Yeah, I so enjoyed having this conversation and enjoyed meeting you guys. So to everyone, we are actually going to have a Google form that we send out along with this recording. Just for everyone, we want to collect stories from you guys of what your experiences were like, how this event or just any other conversations about sexuality has affected you. And we want to be able to share it out and just show everyone that you're not alone and that there are so many of us who are going through this experience and so many of us who want to create more opportunities for this type of space. Anything else from you, Rukmini?
No, just thank you all again for being here, for having this conversation. Like, thank you to anyone who watches this. I hope you feel like you're held a little bit, because I certainly did. It's so wonderful to hear other people echo or like put into language things that I didn't really know how to and to know, right? Like Jay was saying, that we aren't alone. And the point of the Google form is just to collect, you know, what has stigma looked like for us as Asian American women. Funny stories, serious stories, you know, something more abstract, whatever, just so we can have something tangible to walk away from this from.
Great. Thank you guys for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, thank you.